Okay.
Thanks, Jens. I've been thinking whether it's lunch, the rain, or the fact that you told the people it's a lawyer that's going to do the presentation. And I think it's the latter, because it's always exhilarating listening to a lawyer. So without any further ado, if anybody would like to come up for a bit of cross-examination and we can start this session. No. In fact, I'll probably be dissing my profession slightly today. So as we said, we're looking at leveraging public infrastructure. And as we go through it, we'll explore, from a policy and a regulatory perspective, where that leaves us going for the future. But to understand the future, we need to, much like Chris did in his presentation, also have a look at what's happening today, what we learned from the past, what we learned from the future. And that comes from the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius: do not worry about the future. We will use the wisdom that we gain from the fights today when we get there. So necessarily we have to look at what is happening today. So I had to change the slide because I loved that one point in Eugene's slide. Back when the law defied logic. It still defies logic if we don't look at it properly. But just as a basic background from where I'm coming from, because I'm focusing on policy and I'm focusing on legislation, is first of all we have policy. Our policy will typically be influenced by politics, socio-economic conditions, very high level, 50,000 foot type of considerations. That then translates into form of primary legislation. The Electronic Communications Act, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, RICA, these are all primary legislations. It's either in the form of national or provincial legislation, and it comes from a legislature. You then have subordinate legislation, which you have municipal bylaws and regulations. And below that you've got standards, and they follow this order of preference. And it's fairly important to understand this, because if we have an issue with standards or subordinate with regulations and they don't work for us, then we have to go change the law, because the regulation can only be made within the empowering provisions that the law provides for. And if that is in conflict with policy, then we need to change policy. So if the problems we have here is very difficult to roll up. And so for the purposes of today's conversation, we're looking at primary legislation and policy, because that's where we need to fix if we need to fix, so that it can work here. So our role players and this is not a complete list, but it's a generalization, but at the policy level, we typically deal with lobbyists and politicians. They know not much. Depends on who the activists and the lobbyists are. Okay. You guys, just as a snapshot, who regards themselves as engineers or technologists in this room currently? Okay, so the majority, so I'm talking to the right people. Typically, looking at and commenting on and unraveling legislation is left to the lawyers and the regulatory consultants. And when we go into the regulations, we start seeing more operational people becoming involved, working with the lawyers. And at the standards level, we get the engineers and the techies getting more involved and trying to figure that out. And what I'm going to show to you today is that actually, when the law and the standards don't work, then at that level, we get this bemused look. And typically is, what have you lawyers done when you were looking at the legislation? And it's because lawyers don't consider the technical aspects of what we do in this industry. And the technical guys don't consider the legal aspects, because none of us understand what the other thinks about and does. And I'm going to show you today that causes a bit of a disjoint, which stunts the progress that we would like to make as an industry. So the drivers for open access as we quickly go through, because these influence policy. Now, on the left-hand side, when we look at policy, and policy and both influence policy, but we've got terminology like ubiquitous access, increased household penetration, increasing competition, reduction of cost. These are all the standard buzzwords that we know and throw along. But also what drives open access is advances in technology. So we get advances in modulation schemes. We get advances in transport protocols, in encapsulation schemes. We get advances in integrated antenna systems. The technology gets cleverer and better, and it opens up more possibilities. We can't necessarily always take practical use of these advances without the lawyers coming to tell you that the law doesn't allow for it. So that brings me to my next slide, the barrier to policy. And look at the last line. If you don't care about technical reality, hire a lawyer. What we have is internal in the industry, very, very high level, is that, and you've heard James speaking. He touched on this where he said, oh, but there's technical considerations and there's commercial considerations. But ultimately, all this boils down to is trust. And trust is an aspect that Steve Stong wrote a brilliant article about, the cost of not trusting each other. So you're more than welcome to go look up that article if you haven't read it. That then feeds into external, where we have conflicting policies or ostensibly conflicting policies. We have implementation of policies which fall flat. And then we have regulations lagging. And these feed each other. And so that is the background. Let's look at policy specifically relating to public infrastructure. So at a high level, we've got ICT policies. We've got SIP 15 coming out of the Strategic Infrastructure Plan. And what we see there is that it calls for seamless information infrastructure. Clearly wording at a high level that talks about a concept of open access. That then feeds into the National Integrated ICT Policy, where we see that the panel recommends policy objectives must be pursued in promoting open access regime. So open access is not something we should be debating how can we do it, whether we want to do it, if it needs to be done. It's policy. 100% last mile connectivity using open access on all platforms, including fixed wireless and fiber, must be mandated through policy. It's there, it's taking us there. What we should be debating is not how, whether, it's how are we going to implement this? How do we want to drive our lobbying to make sure that it works for us? Because of this policy, it drives demand for access to public infrastructure, whether it is buildings, high sites, whether it's lampposts, or whether it is water towers, and there's a multitude of other examples. Now, getting access to this for your typical small to medium-sized business is very, very difficult. And it creates problems, and we need to understand why, and if it's because of conflicting or because we don't know how to interpret it. The implementation, as I said, I think if you go look at when MTN initially launched their lamppost masts with the City Power of Johannesburg, it created a massive, massive issue because they never went through the appropriate processes. So we see implementation falling flat there. Now, if we look at public infrastructure policies, so we need to look at that to understand that, is that comes out of our National Development Plan 2030, which out of that came the Integrated Urban Development Framework. And this is the framework that tells essentially cities, towns, municipal districts, how they should be planning their infrastructure rollout and development, and how they should be using that. And what is concerning for me is if you look at this came out of the Infrastructure Dialogue South Africa, it's an annual compendium 2014-15, and if you look at what they prioritize there, you will not see any relation or any mention of ICT, of wireless, of open access, of networks of any sort. And very importantly is that the first priority is spend money where most needed. And I think we need to understand this. Is that at the priority level when it comes to the SIP 18 implementation is open access, although it's a priority on the, somewhere else, SIP 15, it's not a priority here. The question we must ask ourselves is why, and I'll be talking to you about that just now. So if you look at specifically with the focus on public infrastructure, under SIP 18, which is your public infrastructure plan, the priorities are water, electricity, sanitation, roads, most of your standard living utilities. These differ per municipality because each municipality must file an integrated development plan spanning 3-year period, addressing what is most pressing for that 3-year period. So we can't stand here and tell you that it's either water, electricity, sanitation. It's dependent on every single local municipality. On the other hand, as an industry, we want access to the infrastructure they build. But if they're building electricity or water and we don't know about it, then we can't properly engage with that particular municipality to say, you are going on this drive, include me in X, Y, Z manner, and I can become a partner with you in this integrated development plan of yours. That's not happening. So essentially what we have is we have an industry, us sitting here. We've got OEMs, we've got equipment manufacturers, we've got licensees, we've got facilities providers, we've got a myriad of stakeholders in our industry. And we look at ourselves only internally. And back at the Infrastructure Development Forum, there's a similar parallel event happening, but they look at themselves. And those are the state-owned companies, the utilities providers, the municipalities, the independent power producers. They sit and they come up with their own development plans. But we have a wall between each other. We don't talk to each other. So park that thought for a while. I'm going to come back to it now. But let's just focus on our legislative, our regulatory environment. So because we're talking about public infrastructure, I'll focus on property owned by public entities. But essentially, we've got, and this is not a strictly legal definition, but it serves to illustrate a point that I'll talk to now. But we've got equipment, we've got capacity, we've got certain property. Those are broadly defined as electronic communications facilities. And then your facilities will, the sum total of them will make a network. So as we look at each of these, we look at, if you look at accessing property owned by a public entity, you've got your rights under Section 22, Chapter 4 of the Electronic Communications Act. It needs to be clarified a bit under the Section 21 process, the rapid development guidelines that William Stuckey was talking about. But even now with Link Africa, in the Constitutional Court, they've won at least up to the Constitutional Court. So it's possible to exercise those rights, but it's very, very costly if it gets taken up from a litigation perspective. So not everybody has the appetite to necessarily take that route. So it's not very practical for a vast majority of the members of WAPA. If you look at network services, then, or ECNS, as we all have licenses for, then we look at the Chapter 7 of the Electronic Communications Act and interconnect regulations. But there's a bit of a problem because it looks like the interpretation currently is that interconnect is at a layer 3 level. Now, if that's at a layer 3 level, and we have facilities here, then what happens to layer 1 and layer 2? Where's our recourse to share at layer 1 and layer 2? Because a layer 1 network is neither a facility nor a services level layer 3 service that qualifies for interconnect regulations. So that's a problem that we need to address, and that's an example of where the legal fraternity and the politicians didn't understand the technical element of it, and now there's a big black hole in our regulations. If we look at the facilities, then we look at Chapter 8 and facilities leasing regulations. But this now becomes a problem, because how do you lease radio equipment? How do you lease an integrated antenna system amongst each other? You see, in the back, in the foyer, down here at Radwin, we see these advances in the radio equipment in the antenna systems, where more and more ability is there to provide multi-frequency channels through a single device. But Section 31(1) of the Electronic Communications Act says you may not use a radio device to send or receive any data if you don't have the frequency license to go along with it. And Section 32(1) says you may not possess a radio device if you don't have a frequency license that goes along there. So there's the problem, is we've got a device that I can hold in my hand, and 3 or 4 users can use it. Now who's possessing it? So it requires us to put a whole new a way of thinking about it, because if possession, as we understand it grammatically, was a problem, then the Department of Water's Affairs have got a problem, because they possess a whole lot of equipment on their water towers. So it can't be possession in the ordinary sense of the word. So we need to understand, let's take it and make it more practical. So there's a Terraco. There's a cabinet in Terraco, and 5 different WISPs locate their radio equipment in that. Is Terraco now in breach of this because they possess? It's in their possession? You see, it can't be. It's impractical. So if we said, fine, let's take it a level down, is the person renting that cabinet, is he in possession? It can't be, because there's four racks, and he's subleasing 3 racks in his cabinet. The point I'm trying to illustrate is, if we, as policymakers and lawyers, understood that there's a device, you can hold it in your hand, but it's akin to a co-location cabinet. And there's multiple receivers in that device, or transceivers, but they each run with their own circuits. And they each get separately managed by separate service providers. Then we can take that same logic as Department of Water Affairs or Terraco or the owner, and start saying, but this little device is nothing more than a co-location cabinet, in which there are 4 tenants, and 4 of them possess different elements of what's on that PC board, and that PC board becomes essentially the co-location cabinet, and the circuitry becomes your racks in your co-location cabinet. This is a type of way of looking at things that we can overcome ostensible barriers that we face if we had more technical knowledge helping us with this. If we look at solving the sharing of radio equipment, antennas, and those sort of things, then we look at megahertz. There's an interpretation that there's a prohibition against subleasing. It comes from an interpretation of Section 31(2)A of the Communications Act. But this flies against the policy, because policy says we want open access. Now, if we can't share the very essence of what forms the basis of this link, whether it's middle mile, whether it's last mile, whether it's trunk, whether it's backhaul, then we can't have open access in a real and proper way. Then we can only have wholesale, which I think is debatable whether that's open access or not. And with the advances in technology, we're seeing dynamic frequency allocation, dynamic frequency assignment, and so you actually don't even know what frequency you're using at any given point in time. So how do you pay license fees? How do you calculate license fees? Now this happens, this happens in the satellite industry on the broadband platforms all the time. Multiple providers will share one big carrier, and the capacity is dynamically assigned. Another example of license fees is when you run a satellite hub, and you pay your ground earth station, and you pay your 2,000 Rand per megahertz spared, and that's more than the minimum amount. And you've got 10 different service providers using your platform as an open access network, and all of a sudden they start saying, do we need to pay annual site license fees? Because we don't really know how much capacity we're using and when we're using it. So the only thing we can do is work on 120 Rand minimum. Yet there's an upstream platform provider paying for all the frequency already. So these are the type of anomalies that we need to sort out, and these are the type of anomalies that have come about because at a technology level, there was a disjoint with the policymakers and the lawyers and the politicians. So what lessons do we take out of this? The lessons learned. Specialist regulatory input into lawmaking must be supplemented with technological input. We need, in the commercial world, you will have the Radwins or the Newtex or the HNSs or the Afrin technologies going to their clients and saying, here's our 18 months, here's our 24-month roadmap of what we are busy developing. We have a future view of what the behavior will be in time to come. And we need that future view now so that we can see whether it gels with the policies and the laws and whether we should start lobbying now so that by the time the technology is released, we've done the groundwork for the regulatory framework to be adapted. So we need a lot more cooperation between those horizontal levels I had right in the beginning saying, I don't understand your part, and we need to find a way to understand each other. The next thing is that we need to focus more on cross-industry or cross-functional awareness. We need to go out there and be aware that there's an SA Cities network that works with municipalities on developing their frameworks for developing infrastructure so that we can partake in it. We need to be aware that there's a municipal process going on to develop an integrated development framework for that local municipality where they focus on their priorities and where we can come in and see how we can leverage off of those developments in a way that also suits us, with them knowing about us. And so that brings me to a point which I leave as a point to ponder on. But we need to start considering whether the current focus and purpose of our industry representative bodies, be it WAPA or ESPA, is currently too narrow. Perhaps too internally focused. So what do I think the future should hold? Is we must move away from this structure that I showed you in the beginning to much more of an integrated loop. Because technology changes fast. We're probably the industry in South Africa that has the need for the fastest adaptation to legislation. But it can only happen if there's a continuous loop. As opposed to a linear structure, there should become a circular structure. We need more outward focus of the industry representative bodies. We need the industry representative bodies of the two cross-purpose sectors of this industry, our economy, to start engaging with each other so that you do not have 400 licensees trying to approach 276 local municipalities in random ad hoc ways, but that there's a higher level planning and structuring and awareness and education that happens between the bodies that they belong to and the bodies that we belong to, and almost create sort of industry-wide agreement amongst each other about how we can implement while the legislature thinks about how they should be changing things in future. And as an example, I don't know how many people are actually aware that there's an organization like this, SA Cities Network. And 8 of the largest metropolitans in South Africa belong to them. And this is where they basically decide exactly what the priorities are and how to plan for the future. And it would have been an ideal forum to have a discussion with, to say, guys, you're running SIP 18, we're running SIP 15, we're not meeting each other, we're not understanding each other, how can we, for example, as WAPA and you as SA Cities Network, start creating a dialogue where we move together, as opposed to fight with each other 400 times 276. And then coming out of that, we should be enabling a much more public-private partnerships. And I think the presentations around Euro Telecoms have been, and Project Isizwe is a great example of how those public-private partnerships can become very, very helpful. So as a final word, I'm very critical of where we are now, but we're in the middle. Don't give up. Thank you.